For years, the neighbors only knew him as the Junkyard dog, a ragged creature chained among rusted cars, surviving on scraps and rainwater. Children crossed the street in fear, and adults turned their eyes away. But across the road lived Henry, an old man who had long stopped believing he could make a difference. Every morning he saw the dog's eyes through the fence, tired, waiting, yet strangely hopeful. One stormy afternoon, when the barking turned into silence, Henry picked up his cane, crossed the road and opened the gate. What followed wasn't just a rescue, it was redemption. In saving the dog, Henry reopened the part of his heart that still remembered love, the kind that expects nothing in return. There are places in every town that people pretend not to see. Corners where rust gathers, where weeds push through cracked concrete, where the world seems to have given up on itself. In the small industrial pocket of Millbrook, Pennsylvania, that place was the old Junkyard on Ashford Street, a sprawling graveyard of metal and memories, fenced in by chain link and silence. And in the heart of that decay, there lived a dog. No one knew his real name. No one knew how long he had been there. The neighbors simply called him the Junkyard dog, as if he were part of the landscape itself, another broken thing left behind. He was chained to a post near the back of the lot, surrounded by the skeletal remains of cars that had long since surrendered to time. His coat, once perhaps golden or tan, had faded to a dull grey-brown, matted with dirt and oil, his ribs pressed against his skin like the bars of a cage from the inside. Children who walked to school along Ashford Street would quicken their pace when they passed the Junkyard. Sometimes they heard him barking, a raw, hoarse sound that seemed more like a warning than a plea. Mothers pulled their children closer, whispering reassurances that the dog couldn't reach them, that he was locked away for a reason. Adults averted their eyes, convinced that someone else surely fed him, that someone else was responsible. But the truth was simpler and crueler. No one was. The Junkyard had been abandoned years ago when its owner, a gruff man named Caleb Shaw, had been taken to a nursing home after a stroke. The property became a legal tangle, caught between distant relatives who didn't care and a county system too overwhelmed to act. And the dog, left behind in the chaos, became a ghost among the ruins. He survived on rainwater that pooled in old tire rims, on scraps tossed over the fence by the rare passerby who felt a flicker of guilt, on the small creatures he could catch within the radius of his chain. But mostly he survived on something harder to name, a stubborn refusal to disappear, a faint ember of life that refused to go out even when everything around him had gone cold. Across the street from the Junkyard, in a narrow two-story house with peeling white paint and a sagging porch, lived Henry Caldwell. Henry was 73 years old, a widower, a retired factory worker, and a man who had grown accustomed to smallness. His world had contracted over the years, first when his wife, Eleanor, passed from cancer, then when his daughter moved to California and stopped calling, then when his knees began to ache and his hands began to shake. He had learned to live quietly, to expect nothing, to move through his days like water following the path of least resistance. Every morning, Henry sat in his armchair by the front window with a cup of instant coffee, looking out at the street. He had stopped reading the newspaper years ago. Too much tragedy, too much noise. Instead, he watched the rhythm of the neighborhood, the mailman's truck, the school bus, the joggers in their bright synthetic clothes. And every morning, without fail, he saw the dog. The Junkyard was directly across from his house, separated only by the width of Ashford Street. From his window, Henry could see through the gaps in the fence, could make out the shape of the animal moving among the wreckage. Sometimes the dog paced. Sometimes he lay still for hours, his head resting on his paws. And sometimes, more often than Henry liked to admit, the dog simply stared back at him. It was the eyes that Henry couldn't shake. Even from a distance, even through rust and shadow, the dog's eyes were clear. They weren't wild or vicious, they weren't empty, they were waiting, patient, as if the dog knew something that Henry had forgotten. Henry told himself it wasn't his problem. He told himself that someone else would handle it, that he was too old, too tired, too broken himself to take on another burden. He told himself that the world was full of suffering and one man couldn't fix it all. But every morning he looked, and every morning the dog looked back. Winter came early that year. By mid-November, the trees along Ashford Street were bare, their branches like cracks in a frozen sky. The wind carried the smell of snow and engine oil. The neighborhood tucked itself in, closing doors and windows, retreating into warmth and routine. And in the junkyard, the dog's barking grew quieter. Henry noticed it first on a Tuesday morning. The usual sound, that ragged, desperate bark, was absent. He sat by the window longer than usual, peering through the fence, searching for movement. Finally, he saw the dog lying near the post, his body curled tight against the cold. He wasn't moving. Henry felt something twist in his chest. He stood, leaning heavily on his cane, and moved to the front door. He opened it, letting the cold air rush in, and stood on the porch. From there, he could see the dog more clearly. The animal's breathing was shallow, visible only by the faint rise and fall of his ribcage. For a long moment, Henry just stood there. Then he went back inside, closed the door, and sat down in his chair. He told himself it was too late. He told himself the dog was probably dying, that there was nothing he could do. He told himself that getting involved would only mean more pain, more loss, more proof that care was a fool's errand. But the image of those eyes stayed with him. Patient, waiting. That night, Henry barely slept. The storm came 3 days later. It wasn't a blizzard, but it was enough. Thick, wet snow that turned the streets into grey slush. Wind that rattled the windows and made the old house groan. The power flickered twice before settling into an uneasy glow. Henry sat in his chair, wrapped in a wool blanket, watching the snow swirl past the streetlights. And then he heard it. At first, he thought it was the wind. But no, it was something else. A sound that barely registered above the storm, thin and distant and wrong. It was whimpering. Henry's chest tightened. He stood, ignoring the protest of his knees, and moved to the window. Across the street, the junkyard was half hidden by the snow, but he could still make out the shape of the dog. The animal was lying on his side now, his chain partially buried in the drifting snow. His body was trembling. Henry pressed his hand against the cold glass. He thought of Eleanor. He thought of the way she used to scold him for hesitating, for overthinking, for letting fear masquerade as practicality. She would have been out that door already, storm or no storm. She would have told him that waiting was just another word for giving up. He thought of his daughter, who had stopped calling because he had stopped trying. He thought of all the years he had spent sitting in this chair, convincing himself that smallness was safety, and he thought of the dog, chained, freezing, waiting for someone to care. Henry pulled on his coat. He found his old work gloves in the closet, along with a flashlight that still had some life in it. He picked up his cane, opened the front door, and stepped into the storm. The cold hit him like a fist. Snow stung his face, and the wind tried to push him back, but Henry pressed forward, gripping his cane, moving one slow step at a time down the porch stairs and onto the sidewalk. Crossing Ashford Street felt like crossing a border he couldn't uncross. Each step was deliberate, each step was a choice. When he reached the junkyard gate, he paused. The chain link was frozen, the padlock rusted and covered in ice. For a moment Henry considered turning back, but then he looked through the fence and saw the dog's eyes, still open, still watching. The gate wasn't locked. The padlock was threaded through the chain, but it hadn't been clicked shut. Henry pulled it free, the metal scraping against itself, and pushed the gate open. The hinges screamed. Henry stepped inside. The junkyard was a labyrinth of metal and shadow. Stacks of tires leaned like drunken towers. Gutted cars sat in silent rows, their hoods open like mouths. Snow covered everything, softening the edges, making the wreckage look almost peaceful. Henry moved carefully, his flashlight cutting a thin path through the dark. He followed the sound of the whimpering, weaving between the debris until he reached the back corner of the lot. And there, chained to a rusted post, was the dog. Up close, he looked even worse than Henry had imagined. His fur was matted and filthy, his body skeletal. His paws were raw from pacing on the frozen ground. But when the dog saw Henry, something shifted in his expression. The fear didn't leave, but it softened. The trembling slowed. Henry knelt down, his knees aching, and set the flashlight on the ground. He pulled off one glove and extended his hand slowly, palm down, letting the dog catch his scent. The dog didn't move. He just watched, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Henry didn't speak. He didn't make promises or reassurances. He simply stayed there, kneeling in the snow, letting the animal decide. After what felt like an eternity, the dog shifted. He lifted his head, just slightly, and his nose brushed against Henry's fingers. It was the smallest gesture, but it was enough. Henry examined the chain. It was heavy, industrial grade, secured to the post with a rusted clasp. He tried to pry it open with his bare hands, but his fingers were too stiff, too weak. He looked around, searching for something to use as leverage, and finally spotted a crowbar lying half-buried near a stack of rims. He retrieved it, returned to the dog, and wedged the crowbar into the clasp. He pushed down with all his weight, feeling the metal resist, then give. The clasp snapped open with a crack that echoed through the junkyard. The chain fell away. For a moment the dog didn't move. He stared at the chain as if he didn't believe it was gone. Then, slowly, he stood. His legs shook, his body swayed, but he stood. Henry reached out gently and rested his hand on the dog's head. The animal didn't pull away. Henry looped his belt through the dog's collar, a makeshift leash, and began the slow journey back through the junkyard. The dog followed, unsteady but willing, his paws crunching through the snow. When they reached the gate, Henry paused. He looked back at the junkyard one last time, at the rusted cars, the forgotten machinery, the place where the dog had been left to die. Then he stepped through the gate, the dog at his side, and pulled it shut behind him. The walk across Ashford Street was slow. The dog's legs gave out twice, and each time Henry waited, crouching beside him, until the animal found the strength to stand again. When they finally reached Henry's front porch, the old man opened the door and held it wide. The dog hesitated at the threshold, as if crossing into warmth was something he no longer knew how to do. But Henry waited, and eventually the dog stepped inside. The house smelled like dust and old coffee and silence. The dog stood in the entryway, dripping snow onto the worn floorboards, his body rigid with uncertainty. Henry closed the door behind them, sealing out the storm, and for the first time in years, the house felt less empty. Henry moved slowly, every action measured and deliberate. He knew the dog was frightened, knew that trust was a fragile thing that could shatter with one wrong move. So he didn't rush, he didn't crowd. He simply went about the quiet work of care. First, he filled a bowl with lukewarm water and set it on the kitchen floor. The dog watched from the doorway, his ears pinned back, his body tense. Henry stepped away, giving him space, and busied himself with finding something edible. His own pantry was sparse: crackers, canned soup, instant oatmeal. But he found a package of deli turkey in the fridge, only a day past its sell-by date. He tore it into small pieces and placed them on a plate beside the water bowl. Then he retreated to his chair by the window and waited. The dog didn't move for a long time. He stood in the doorway, his eyes darting between Henry and the food, calculating risk. Finally, driven by a hunger that overrode fear, he crept forward. His movements were slow, cautious, as if the floor itself might betray him. When he reached the bowl, he drank first. Long, desperate gulps that spoke of days without enough water. Then he ate, swallowing the turkey in quick, anxious bites, barely chewing. Henry watched in silence. He felt a strange tightness in his throat, an unfamiliar heat behind his eyes. He had forgotten what it felt like to matter to another living thing. That first night, the dog slept on the floor near the front door, as far from Henry as the small house allowed. Henry didn't try to move him. He simply covered him with an old blanket and left him alone. He knew that healing didn't happen on anyone's schedule but its own. The days that followed settled into a quiet rhythm. Henry woke early, as he always had, and found the dog still by the door, watching him with those patient, waiting eyes. He fed him small meals throughout the day. More turkey, some rice, scrambled eggs, careful not to overwhelm a stomach that had known mostly emptiness. He refilled the water bowl. He opened the back door to let the dog outside into the small fenced yard, where the animal would stand in the cold for a few minutes before returning inside, still uncertain that the door would stay open. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to change. By the end of the first week, the dog had moved from the doorway to the living room. He no longer flinched when Henry walked past. He began to eat more readily, his body starting to fill out, the sharpest edges of his ribs softening beneath his matted fur. Henry knew the dog needed a bath. The smell of the junkyard still clung to him, oil and rust and old fear. But Henry also knew that forcing the issue would break whatever fragile trust they had built. So he waited. On the 9th day, Henry ran a warm bath. He didn't call the dog. He simply left the bathroom door open and sat on the edge of the tub, letting the sound of running water fill the house. After a few minutes, the dog appeared in the doorway, curious. Henry didn't move. He just sat there, his hand trailing in the water, showing that it was safe. The dog crept forward, sniffing the air, and eventually pressed his nose against Henry's wet hand. Henry waited a moment longer, then gently, carefully lifted the dog and lowered him into the tub. The animal tensed, his claws scrambling against the porcelain, but he didn't try to jump out. Henry worked quickly, using a mild shampoo and warm water, washing away the layers of filth that had accumulated over months, maybe years. The water turned grey, then brown, then black. Henry drained the tub twice, refilling it each time, until finally the water ran clear and the dog's true color began to emerge. He wasn't grey. He was a soft, tawny gold, with darker markings around his ears and muzzle. When Henry finally lifted him out and wrapped him in towels, the dog stood on the bathroom mat, shaking and soaked, but somehow transformed. He looked younger, lighter, as if the weight of the junkyard had been washed away with the dirt. Henry dried him carefully, then led him back to the living room. The dog curled up on the blanket near the window, and for the first time he seemed to relax. His breathing deepened, his eyes closed, and Henry, sitting in his chair with a cup of coffee, felt something he hadn't felt in years. He felt needed. Winter deepened outside, but inside the house on Ashford Street, something was thawing. The dog began to follow Henry from room to room, no longer content to watch from a distance. He learned the patterns of the house, where the food came from, where the warmth was strongest, where Henry sat in the evenings. He began to respond to Henry's voice, not with the fear of a beaten animal, but with the cautious hope of one learning to trust again. Henry started talking to him, not in the performative way people sometimes talk to pets, but in the quiet, conversational way he used to talk to Eleanor. He told the dog about his life, about the factory where he had worked for 30 years, about his daughter who lived in San Diego and never visited, about Eleanor's garden and the way she used to hum while pulling weeds. The dog listened, his head resting on his paws, his eyes tracking Henry's movements. And slowly, the dog began to change Henry. Too. Henry found himself waking earlier, not because he had to, but because the dog was waiting. He started cooking real meals again, not just for the dog, but for himself. He fixed the broken step on the back porch so the dog could go outside more easily. He called the vet, the first phone call he had made in months, and scheduled an appointment. The day they went to the vet was cold and bright, the sky a hard, clear blue. Henry borrowed a leash from his neighbor, Mrs. Chen, who asked no questions but smiled knowingly. The dog walked beside him, tentative but trusting, as they made their way to the small clinic 3 blocks away. The vet, a young woman named Dr. Patel, was gentle and efficient. She examined the dog thoroughly, noting the scars, the old injuries, the signs of prolonged neglect. She estimated his age at around 6 or 7, middle-aged for a dog his size. She gave him vaccinations, treated him for parasites, and prescribed supplements to help him regain his strength. But what struck Henry most was what she said at the end of the appointment. She looked at the dog, then at Henry, and smiled. "You saved his life, you know. Another week out there, and he wouldn't have made it." Henry didn't know what to say. He simply nodded and paid the bill. On the walk home, the dog stayed close to Henry's side. His tail, which had hung low and motionless for so long, gave a small, tentative wag. It was the first time Henry had seen him do that. That night, as Henry sat in his chair reading an old paperback, the dog did something he had never done before. He stood up from his blanket, walked across the room, and rested his head on Henry's knee. Henry froze, his hand hovering above the dog's head. Then, slowly, he let it fall, his fingers sinking into the soft, clean fur. The dog closed his eyes, and Henry, for the first time in a very long time, felt his heart open. Spring came quietly to Millbrook. The snow melted, revealing the bruised grass and the debris of winter. The trees along Ashford Street began to bud, their branches softening with pale green promise. The world, which had seemed frozen and final, began to breathe again. And in the narrow house with the peeling white paint, Henry Caldwell and the dog who had once been nameless learned what it meant to heal together. The dog, whom Henry had taken to calling Jasper, after his own father, grew stronger with each passing week. His coat thickened and shone. His eyes, once dull and guarded, became bright and alert. He put on weight, his body filling out until he no longer looked like a shadow of a dog, but like a dog fully inhabiting his own life. He began to play, chasing leaves in the backyard, tossing sticks into the air with a joy that seemed almost startling after so much suffering. But the transformation wasn't just physical. Jasper became Henry's companion in a way that went beyond simple coexistence. He seemed to understand Henry's moods, his rhythms, his silences. On days when Henry's knees ached and moving was difficult, Jasper stayed close, his presence a quiet reassurance. On days when Henry felt the weight of loneliness pressing down, Jasper rested his head on Henry's lap, offering a comfort that needed no words, and Henry in turn found himself changing. He started leaving the house more often. He walked Jasper through the neighborhood, greeting neighbors he hadn't spoken to in years. Mrs. Chen, who had lent him the leash, began stopping by with homemade dumplings. The mailman, a young man named Terence, started pausing to pet Jasper and ask how he was doing. The world, which had seemed to shrink around Henry, began to expand again. One afternoon in late April, Henry sat on the front porch with Jasper at his feet, watching the street. A car pulled up across the road, and a man in a suit stepped out. He stood looking at the junkyard, shaking his head, then pulled out a phone and made a call. Henry watched with mild curiosity. The next day, a crew arrived with a truck and heavy equipment. They began clearing the junkyard, hauling away the rusted cars, the old tires, the accumulated wreckage of decades. It took them a week. By the time they were finished, the lot was empty, the fence pulled down, the ground scraped clean. Henry stood on his porch, Jasper beside him, looking at the vacant space. The place that had been Jasper's prison was gone, erased, as if it had never existed. But Jasper had existed, and he was here now, warm and alive and free. One evening, as the sun set over Millbrook, Henry's phone rang. He almost didn't answer. He so rarely received calls anymore. But something made him pick it up. It was his daughter Rebecca. Her voice was tentative, apologetic. She said she had been thinking about him. She said she was sorry for letting so much time pass. She said she wanted to visit, if that was okay. Henry, holding the phone with a hand that trembled slightly, looked down at Jasper, who was watching him with those patient, knowing eyes. He said yes. Rebecca arrived 3 weeks later. She was older than Henry remembered, lines around her eyes, grey threading through her dark hair. She stood on the porch, nervous, holding a suitcase, and when Henry opened the door, she didn't know what to say, but Jasper did. He walked up to her, tail wagging, and pressed his nose against her hand. Rebecca laughed, a surprised, genuine sound, and knelt down to pet him. "Who's this?" she asked, looking up at her father. Henry smiled. "This is Jasper." They spent the weekend together, the three of them. Rebecca cooked meals in the small kitchen, telling stories about her life in California, about her work, about the things she had been afraid to say. Henry listened and talked, and found that the words came more easily than he expected. They walked through the neighborhood with Jasper, who seemed delighted to have another person to charm. They sat on the porch in the evenings, watching the light fade, and didn't need to fill every silence. On the last night as they sat together, Rebecca looked at her father. "You seem different," she said, "happier." Henry glanced at Jasper, who was curled up at his feet. "I had help," he said simply. Rebecca reached over and squeezed his hand. "I'm glad you found him, Dad, or that he found you." Henry nodded. "Me too." After Rebecca left, promising to visit again soon, Henry sat alone on the porch with Jasper. The evening was warm, the air soft with the smell of spring. Across the street, where the junkyard had once stood, there was now just empty space, but it was a clean emptiness, a blank canvas waiting for something new. Henry thought about the years he had spent sitting in that chair by the window, watching the world from a distance, convinced that he had nothing left to give. He thought about the dog chained in the cold, waiting for someone to care. He thought about the storm that had driven him out of his house and across the street, the choice that had seemed so small but had changed everything. He realized something then, something that Eleanor had tried to tell him years ago, but that he had been too stubborn to hear. Redemption isn't a grand, singular moment. It's a series of small choices. To care when it's easier not to open your heart when it's safer to keep it closed, to believe that your actions matter even when the world tells you they don't. Jasper had needed saving, but in truth, so had Henry. And in the act of saving each other, they had both learned what it meant to live again. As the stars emerged overhead and the neighborhood settled into its evening quiet, Henry reached down and rested his hand on Jasper's head. The dog sighed contentedly, his tail giving a slow, peaceful wag. "We're okay now," Henry said softly. "Aren't we, boy?" Jasper's eyes met his, patient, trusting, and full of a love that expected nothing in return. And Henry, for the first time in years, believed that maybe, just maybe, the world was still worth caring about after all. The story could end there, with Henry and Jasper on the porch, healed and whole. But the truth is that healing rarely stays contained. It spreads quietly, like light through water. Mrs. Chen, inspired by Henry's transformation, began volunteering at the local animal shelter. Terence, the mailman, adopted a senior dog who had been overlooked for months. Rebecca, when she returned for Thanksgiving, brought her own rescue dog to meet Jasper. and the two played in the backyard while Henry cooked dinner, the house filled with laughter for the first time in a decade. And in the neighborhood, people started noticing. They saw the old man who used to sit alone now, walking every day with his golden dog. They saw him smile. They saw him stop to chat, to help, to engage. And some of them, not all, but some, began to wonder if they too had been sitting by the window too long. The junkyard was eventually turned into a community garden. Neighbors came together to plant vegetables, flowers, benches. Children played where Jasper had once been chained. Life bloomed where there had been only decay. And on warm evenings, if you walked past the house with the peeling white paint, you might see them there, the old man and the dog, sitting together on the porch, watching the world with eyes that had learned to hope again. Because the truth is this: we are all capable of being saved, and we are all capable of saving. Sometimes it just takes one person willing to cross the street. Sometimes it just takes love that expects nothing in return. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, Beyond the Instinct, for more true stories about the unbreakable bond between humans and animals. Stories of compassion, redemption, and the transformative power of love. Because every life matters, and every act of kindness creates ripples we may never see, but that change the world nonetheless. Thank you for reading. Thank you for caring. And never forget, it's never too late to open the gate.